Well, hello, everybody, and here we are again. And this is episode 13 of Interviews with an Exorcist, the Gabriel Chronicles. And I'm here with my best friend, cohort, Dr. Douglas Gabriel, and he's recounting to us his many and manifold adventures throughout Europe and North Africa and in the Holy Land. And this is something that's, of course, very near and dear to anybody who's a serious student of Rudolf Steiner's spiritual science. And one of the key pages in that story is the mystery of the Knights Templar. And Douglas gave me a hint that he wanted to turn that corner. And so we've completed our cube, and now we can move on beyond the cube into the next chamber. And in memory of that, I want to dedicate this to Fred Parsons. He's a seventh generation esoteric occultist. And he gave me this book. It's the 1874 edition of The Knights Templar by Addison. And in here, because I wanted to do a little bit of show and tell, there's Godfrey de Bouillon. And Godfrey, he was the first king of Jerusalem after the Crusaders came. And here you have an induction ceremony into the order of the Knights Templar. And they were the progenitors of selfless banking. And it was banking that didn't involve usury of any sort. And so that's the kind of function that was taken away and perverted into what we have in the modern world. But we're not going to get that far along in the story this time. But I just wanted to give a little bit of the backstory because it centers around some very key locations. Douglas, how are you?
Great, John. Great. Thank you so much for asking.
So where are we now? You said you wanted to talk regarding Jerusalem and the role of the Knights Templar. And as you know, that's something near and dear to my heart. In fact, when I was in high school, we went into a recording studio, and I think it was the second song we recorded was Crusade. And it was a historically accurate, the lyrics in the song were historically accurate account of the first Crusade. And something I did with my band in high school, the Sleepless Nights. And so it's something that's always lived in me, that I felt that there was something there that held a mystery for me. So I've always been drawn to that. And roses.
You have a Templar sword hanging in your background. Plus, when we first met, we joked back and forth or saw the, Karmic imprint that we had been Templars and at this place and that place. So I hadn't really thought of going into that too much, except for the fact that I was going to mention that I went to Rhodes. Rhodes was, not only where there was the one of the seven wonders of the world, which, by the way, was revealed to me was made of wood. And then many years later, they finally came to that conclusion that the Colossus of Rhodes was wooden. But anyway, so we go there and go ashore off this big cruise boat and start walking around, and I'm like taken back in time. Oh my gosh, this is just like what happened in Vienna. And the Templar fort there is 100% perfectly preserved. I had walked that place before, and it was the same ground. It wasn't like the 12 feet below your feet where Jesus walked when you're walking through Jerusalem and you look down, oh, that's where Jesus walked. No, you are walking where you walked if you were there as a Templar. And of course, Rhodes was one of the main places that the Templars had possession of for a long time. And of course, there were other cities that they're in possession of, but I didn't know anything about the Templars really at all. Let me think. Did I know anything about the Templars? A little, because they were part of the religious studies, the Crusades and blah, blah. But I didn't know much about them. So I walked up to the fort, opened a door, which I don't know if it was supposed to be open, walked in, and I knew every inch of the place. Walked up to the battlements, walked all over. It was like nobody was there. Again, it was just like in Vienna. Nobody else was there except me. And I just walked around and nobody stopped me. It was like maybe they saw me. Maybe I was invisible. I don't know. But, to get into the places that later I found out, it's a tourist spot, it's like one of these museums. You don't just go wandering around in these places, right? So I basically re-ensheathed a part of my incarnation as a Templar. It was amazing. But it didn't give me much cognitive knowledge. It just gave me a physical, absolute assurance that I had been a Templar and told me what part I played in being a Templar. And then it was like, oh, well, wait, then there's these other places I have to go visit because I read some conspiracy theories about the prior to Zion and the Templars and all the surface stuff. But what did I really know about Templars? Very little. So when I returned to Europe proper from Greece, I went to Rene Chateau, went to Montsegur, went to St. Denis, but it was at St. Denis. Well, by the way, Rhodes let me describe it a little bit. It's a perfectly preserved, probably the oldest and most perfectly preserved city. But there's Carcassonne, there's uh, uh, Regensburg, there's just a few places that I know like that literally you walk into it and you are taken back in time. I don't care whether you're psychic or not. You are absolutely transported back in time. And that's one of those places, especially when you enter the fort, which has stood the test of time. And I loved old places. So I went in there and touched this and touched that. And they had all these displays and stuff, touched swords and touched shields and armor and documents, stuff that they, or didn't touch documents, but, touched anything that was documenting the time of the Templars. So it was very powerful. And I began to understand that that's where my proclivity for breaking codes comes from. I guess I was not the big warrior who went out and beat down the enemy, though I'm sure I took my part in that. I was one of the people who was the Templar bankers, as it were, the people who certified whether the check was going to clear by using a code. And so that's the reason I was a code breaker into all that stuff in the military. I enjoyed that kind of stuff. So I thought, oh, well, that's very interesting. Don't know what that really does to help me in my life. Helps me understand a little bit more of history, made me interested in it. So I started to look into it. And of course, the Templars, I then find out much, much later that the Templars protected all the relics. So if I was interested in the blood relics of Jesus Christ, held by Mary, passed on to Longinus, Joseph of Arimathea, and others, Peter, perhaps, it was very important to understand these things. So it really was an eye-opener to see that kind of incarnation come back without really any help. It didn't help anything. And so now I understand why, people who go on and on about talking about their incarnations, exactly who they were. And in all cases, they were the great, big hero, or, Nefertiti, or they were Mother Mary, or they're Mary Magdalene, or it's like, no, you weren't. And so the people that I think I know who I was, they weren't very important, which is a good thing. It's a good sign for me that I wasn't a delusional person and that I actually did really do exactly what Steiner told me not to do, go and try to take upon myself the sheaths of previous incarnations. You could take on your ego sheath, your astral, your etheric, your physical, and you don't want to do that. If you see insight, good, I think now, upon reflection. But when it comes down to it, unless it's going to help you in your path to understand how you put Christ on the throne of your heart, I really don't know how it's going to help you. But with the Templars holding these sacred blood relics, now I understand how critical that is. And I'm going to flash to the future. that many years later, Tyler and I had sent to us what surely would have been held by the Templars. We believe it was in the imperial regalia of the Habsburgs, both when it was in Vienna and Hohenzollern, how do you say it? Hohenzollern Castle. The Habsburgs, before the Habsburgs, they were the Hohenzollern or whatever. So, we know that it was there and that it was passed down, but it was probably misunderstood. So we came into the possession of somebody sending it to heal me. They actually sent it to heal me. So we vetted it and found out that one of these holy relics is the Spear of Antioch, the spear that the Templars, well, later Templars, but the first Crusaders, and certainly later the Templars were associated with. In the first crusade that carried this Spear of Antioch, which was dug up in Antioch when they were basically being surrounded by the Muslims, the Christian Crusaders. One of them had a vision and said, dig under the altar, and lo and behold, what they find? The very thing that you need in the old church to conduct the Last Supper. You need a knife to cut the bread. And here you have in the Eastern Orthodox, they literally put the spear of Longinus there, and they cut the bread into the shape they want. And it has to be one of the elements. And so it is purported that the spear of Longinus, because it was a blood relic, was given to Mary along with the cup of the Last Supper, along with the, as I mentioned, the crown of thorns, the nails, anything that ever touched him that was blood, including his circumcised skin, which one church in Europe says they have, which turns liquid at a certain feast day. So, I'm thinking, what is all this? Well, the Templars held these things, right? And it was a very humble spear. And so you could check it out very easily. So we have proof that we checked it out with the best weapons experts in Europe. And it is indeed a first century Roman centurion hasta magnus, which means it had meteorite in it, which dates it to exactly the first century BC, right up to the time of Christ. So this spear then has a staff connected to it that is dated to the 8th century, end of the 7th, beginning of the 800s, the 8th century. And it came along at the same time that the Spear of Maurice happened to have been created, when a lot of these relics came forth. So I wanted to point out that I'm not making fun of relics. If you take a relic and if you take a piece of the cloth of Mary and you touch it to another cloth, it becomes a tier 2. Or if you hand Father Solinus, the saint from Detroit, or you hand Padre Pio a handkerchief and he blesses it, hands it back to you, it stays charged for a very, very long time. I know that. I ran across one of them by accident, knew what it was before they opened the drawer. Said, what do you have in there? Something of Padre Pio's. And how do you know that? And the lady had been healed from it. So second tier relics are not to be laughed at, even third tier, fourth tier relics, because the worship that goes into them. So when we're talking about relics, I don't know whether the Spear of Antioch, which we call the Spear of Love, and we did vet it and we wrote a book. It's that whole lineage of the provenance up to the point that we could prove it, as well as speculation that does tie it to a logical conclusion, is in the book, The Queens of the Grail. And so, the Templars are very real. They held these blood relics. So when it comes down to it, they are the keys to the Holy Grail.
Yes. And if you follow the study more closely, you see that the first church was the Church of Antioch, and that was the Church of Peter, and that in fact I never knew this until we started looking at these things with Michael McKibben and Douglas and Tyler here regarding the Spear of Longinus, that I found out that a distant ancestor of mine was the Duke of Antioch at one time after the Crusader kingdoms were founded. So there's all these curious connections, but you see that in the Eastern Orthodox service, that there's the cutting of the host in communion, and the host is cut into 9 pieces, which is an interesting number because it ties into that whole idea of the 9 hierarchies that are discussed in the celestial hierarchies by Dionysius, the Areopagite tradition. And in looking at Antioch as being a real key place, in fact, another relative of mine was beheaded at the gates of Antioch during the Crusades, so that there's this really unusual sphere of activity around this area. And even at this time, because when you get into that whole corridor and you get into the whole idea of Armageddon, and the Armageddon, that the presage of Armageddon is the destruction within that region. And so it's very much critical in Earth evolution for many mythic streams, shall we say. But in understanding, yes, the Templars would have been custodians of all manner of treasures and relics and all of that, because they were able to do a safe transport. At that time, if you were just going to go somewhere, you could give, like, say you had some gold, you'd go to the Templar and they would count how much you had, and then they'd write a note in code, and then you would go where you had to go, and you would give it to the preceptory there, and they would give you the equivalent. And so it was the door that opened into extreme developments within commerce. And so you see many of the noble houses joining the Knights Templar. But the Templars, in so doing that, they existed for nearly 2 centuries during the Middle Ages, but they were founded in 1119, and they were headquartered in Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And in understanding this Templar impulse and how Rudolf Steiner is very clear, he says that this Templar stream resurfaced in the mysteries of the Grail and the continuation of that Grail stream. That's the esoteric Christian stream that continues on from the Grail Castle to the Knights Templar to the true Rosicrucian order. And there's a lot of clubs that use a lot of these names, and hey, good on them. At least you're working with some wholesome archetypes. Hopefully you're doing wholesome things, but there's a very real tradition that's very much beneath the surface, that doesn't want to be noticed by the public at large, that's working throughout history to promulgate the cosmic understanding and the cosmology of the biblical relationship to the mystery of Christ. And so if you look at the Templar centers, you see that they were domed, and they would have a slit that would be tied into the equinox. The light would come in at the equinox, and these were mystery centers, and you had a mass that would be served there. And then Rudolf Steiner talks about that they had a high mass that only the initiated members of the order were permitted access to, and there they would receive the teachings. And it's very mysterious, but if you get into Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parsifal, and he talks about the receiving of a star wisdom. And so you have this idea of star wisdom, because remember that they had a fleet, and anybody who had a bunch of ships, well, what were they doing? They had to navigate by the stars. See, so that you have to be able to put these pieces together and say, who would have certain types of information? And then you see all these interlocking pieces come together, and you see that they exist during the same period of time in which flourished the Gothic cathedral. So this is all tying together with this wonderful, deep backstory to the Christ mystery.
Exactly. It's the Holy Grail. It's the blood mysteries of Christ, the only blood that can heal the whole earth and each and every one of us. And so that's the thing that then became kind of prominent in my mind. So I thought, okay, now I can go back to Europe, Central Europe, and look around for some other things. So I went to Foggia because I'd heard there was a Templar tower there. Now they're in the octagonal shape, uh, generally, and they're very distinctive. And sometimes there's just a tower, and it was basically their defense point. But Foggia was a city that was hated so much that they completely razed it to the ground. And Frederick II was there. And then I thought, okay, this is getting deeper. And then I went to Monte Cassino, and then I went to Sicily, and then I went to um, Rennes-le-Chateau, and then I went to Montesegur. And at Montesegur, because so many people had burnt themselves alive there, and because myself and friends had been there before and knew people there who literally did go out and lay in the stream, cut their wrists, and let the cold water let them dream into the spiritual world, which was one of their ritual practices, ritual death. Anyway, it just kept getting more and more open all the time. But finally, I said, well, I need to go to the place that Jacques de Molay was betrayed, which was Saint Denis in Paris. Of course, I'd been there in Paris numerous times, and of course, Notre Dame, dedicated to the Mother, of course, is one of those ones, even on a direct ley line across Virgo, right down the middle of the constellation Virgo, placed on the Earth, as John described, goes right through Notre Dame. But Saint Denis was another one of those Gothic churches that was built on a well, and that is where the Templars were betrayed.
Well, yeah, the tradition of the first really developed Gothic building was the Chapel of Saint Denis, and that's where the kings went through their coronation. And because of the development of the idea of offsetting the weight with what are called flying buttresses, these great stone structures that are outside the church, it could do the weight bearing so that they were able to have stained glass windows. They were able to not need the structure to hold the building up. They could actually vacate some of that, and that would give them a place in which to do the stained glass windows. And so it's really remarkable when you look at the Gothic cathedrals, because they're storybooks in stone, in art, and that you would go to like Chartres, and you'd be led there by one of the monks that would be there, and you'd go from window to window, and they would give you an oral presentation of their particular take on the mysteries of Christianity. So it's a very fascinating, and Rennie Carrito, one of our mentors, wrote a wonderful book on Chartres and the mysteries of Chartres.
Yeah, so Chartres, a very powerful place. Went into the basement there, found the well there, and that place is completely magical. Wow! And literally standing on the steps, there were two friends that I now have as dear friends who I go back to that incarnation with them. I know standing there looking at the portico, watching the new tower be built, knew exactly when it was, and so on and so forth. Those kind of things can't be coincidence. So when I went to St. Denis, it was no coincidence that I had been, I guess, one of the people surrounding the Paris office, the prefectory, and that was in the basement of St. Denis. And that part hasn't been changed. I don't know if the top part has, but that's part very real. So when I went in there, again, I was a Templar. Now, here's the bad news. And I tell people all the time, to be clairvoyant, clairaudient, clairsentient is the worst curse that I would not wish upon my worst friend. It is a terrible curse because sometimes you can't control it, and you are stupid enough, like myself, to go back and try to see who I was in a previous incarnation. So here I am following the trail to what? To the torture I received in that incarnation, torture to death, which has direct bearing upon problems I've had with health in this incarnation. So it doesn't really do you a lot of good to know that, and it certainly doesn't do you any good to go back and to re-unsheath it, to assume that you can take that mantle on yourself. Because in general, As I always say, if you wish to be a visionary, get ready. They're going to show you hell before they show you heaven. So being a Templar in my mind, running around in roads or chasing this trail or that trail, when it finally came to the place, that was it for me. I didn't need any more of that stuff. So I said, okay, I don't care who I was in the previous incarnation. It matters nothing to me. Oh, my experience in Egypt. Well, wouldn't that say that no, it doesn't matter. Who cares? We don't need to know the paths we've gone down before. That's not part of the exploration. It is about finding the right path that goes to the top of the mountain, to the summit. So I decided at that point, couldn't find a home for anthroposophy, uh, uh, my anthroposophical endeavors in Europe or in England, and I couldn't find it in Spring Valley. I couldn't find it in Fair Oaks, California, in Sacramento. But I had already, as I said before, gone through Detroit and helped set up their bookshop and got to know Werner. And uh, I didn't want to live in Detroit, but that was my only choice. So a lot of times the only free will I think I have is to go down the only path I have. And that seemed to be the only path I had. So I came back to Detroit after these visits to Europe. And as soon as I got here, I thought, oh, this is terrible. I felt like I weighed 5 pounds when I was in Europe. And the further east I went, the less I weighed. It was like I was floating above the ground. Come back to America, and it was like weight burden on your shoulders, carrying the weight of the excessive materialistic psychism or psychic effects of America is terrible for a psychic, in my opinion. And I don't know why notice, there's spiritual teachers from every single path that you can name who come to America. And what happened to them? They went into debauchery. Think of it. They all became womanizers, alcoholics. They became excessive beings, addictive personalities, and they didn't work out. I mean, except for the very top Tibetan monks I know, and even them, they become commercialized. They deny their own lineage, blah, blah, all these crazy things. So America is a very tough place for psychics. That's why the Society for Psychogirl Research was in England, and I mentioned that before. They were the ones doing the paranormal research, long before anybody else. But that stuff, as you go east, that's common. You see in India, everywhere, fakers that, can do amazing things that defy basic scientific ideas, settled science. So I came back to Detroit and I said, okay, well, let's see what can happen here. So I decided I was going to settle there. So I went to the Jesuit house. And wouldn't you know, the man who was my, what do you call him? He was the person in charge. Within the second or third interview I had with him, because I was living there in a house, the Jesuit house in Berkeley, Michigan, just a couple blocks away from where I would buy a house and have 3 children in that house. Literally, you can throw a stone and practically hit the house from the Jesuit house that I was living in. And then that guy turned out to be a freak, and he was part of the homosexual club of the Catholic Church. And so I had to leave there and I went downtown. And that's what I didn't want to do because Detroit was dark. It was considered the darkest city in America at that time. And I might have described some of that before. But anyway, Werner had moved from the Detroit Waldorf School in Indian Village. Okay, does anyone ever look into anything? Indian Village was where they massacred the Indians. Why would you build houses for the rich people, mansions, on the 3 streets that were the place where the massacre happened? Oh, and the other place, downtown Detroit, where the house, one of the haunted houses that I lived in, had been one of the 3 oldest houses in Detroit. It was taken apart, moved to Indian Village from this place downtown. Oh, what was downtown? Where they massacred a number of tribes right on that spot. So why is it that after they massacre people there, the rich people move in and don't think the houses are going to be haunted? Because these houses were haunted. You were in the haunted houses, John. These houses were like, oh no one can deny this. This isn't some kind of airy fairy gobbledygook. No, these were very seriously haunted houses. But I had seen in a vision, and I didn't know it until the second time I went back to Detroit, a fountain in a courtyard, a small courtyard surrounded by a stone wall with iron gate, and it entered into this low-lying building. And when I went back the second time, and I went into Indian Village, and I looked at where the new headquarters was, it was in the Kearney building. And that's exactly what I'd seen in my vision years ago when I started on this path. So I'm standing there looking at this going, holy cow, all this diversion for just, I was here quite some time before. And that's when, I don't know if I've told these stories. That's when I was working in the bookshop and Kathleen Kennedy called in, didn't say what she was, but I gave her advice because Werner trusted me from the moment. I told Werner the whole truth. Werner Glass, the head of the Waldorf Institute in Detroit in Indian Village at the Kearney building. And I was going to go into his program because I had VA benefits and I could go to school for many years. And I did on the VA benefits. So I told him from the beginning, and then I said, but now, Werner, I'm back. I can tell you, you don't want to tell anybody that I'm clairvoyant, psychic, whatever words you want to use. Please, you don't want to do that. It could be the end of you. And then I told him about John Gardner. I told him about Francis Edmonds. I told him about, what my experience was. And he goes, okay, just between you and I. But he knew I was a Jesuit, and he knew that I was still studying so that I could glean good stuff to send to the Catholic Church about Waldorf education and anthroposophy. So I got back, couldn't live in the Jesuit house, so I moved into Indian Village. Well, so many of the houses are haunted in that Indian Village. I was busy all the time from then on and became quite well known for doing house cleansings because there were so many ghosts in those giant mansions because the rich people lived in them and they did horrible things and it stuck. It gets stuck and it has to be cleaned. Even the place that Werner had been in before, the Detroit Waldorf School, had been the Liggett School. And the Liggett School was only for the rich from Detroit, who in that case were usually auto industry, the Dodges, the Fords, the top richest people lived in Indian Village and sent their children to this school. Beautiful school. Beautiful. It had Greek reliefs built into the walls. It had, I can't even describe to you. It was very old and beautiful, right? Haunted as you can ever imagine. The entire time I was there, I could not get the negative spirit out of that school. And sometimes the basement floor had a floor that was very cushiony and you could see footprints. Sometimes it would walk right up to me and say, nothing you can do is going to get me out of the school. And I'd say, this is terrible. I couldn't figure it out, couldn't get rid of it. Tried for years. I was there for 11 years or something. And then I finally figured out one day when I was working with the Boilermakers that there were a lot of bones in the furnace. People's bodies had been thrown in there, and the bones had fallen down underneath where the gas came up, and blah 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 blah, all this stuff. But the point is that we had to call the police, and there was literally, we don't even know how many people had been thrown in there, and their body at least was burned. So the place was terribly haunted, and we had a Waldorf school there. Terribly haunted, okay? I can't tell you how haunted that place was. I had to work so hard to try to keep that spirit from divisiveness and, really being bad. And it still was, still did, and still is. But anyway, so I moved in with a family, a very rich family. I think you went to the McCarthys, right? They had, so many cars that I always had a couple of cars I could choose from to drive, and I took care of their 3 children. I was a mother's helper, as it were, and managed their 24 houses that they owned, some of which had apartments in them. So as soon as I came back, I was like in the thick of it. I handled housing for the Waldorf Institute. I handled the bookstore. I worked down at the Waldorf School, and I went through Mercy College and got a BA in Anthroposophical Studies and History with a double minor in History and Psychology. And then I got a master's in Educational Administration and certified. All of those are certified. And then also in Waldorf Education, I was certified. And so I went to school for a long time there at the Waldorf Institute and became a Waldorf teacher there for many years in all kinds of different strange capacities in some cases, and worked through the Waldorf Institute because Werner knew everyone in anthroposophy and brought them to Detroit. So essentially, I want to repeat this in case I didn't say it before. It was strictly by accident that Werner trusted me so much that he turned certain things over to me. And so that's how I talked to Kathleen Kennedy and gave her advice, and that became Spielberg's movie Poltergeist. Later, she called back. Marcia Lucas came there, and Werner said, help her rewrite this movie treatment and make it good, make it beautiful, whatever. So I helped them rewrite the Star Wars, the third treatment, which is basically the substance of 1 through 3 and number 9. That's really what the fairy tale was that I helped write. But none of that really mattered at all to me. And later on, this, that Kathleen Kennedy contacted again while I was at the Institute and worked for years with the ideas of Indiana Jones, which some of those were simply me telling the things that I had been doing or had done before that were like fairy tale adventure stories that had spiritual content to them. But unfortunately, the spiritual content got left on the side, and Otto Rahn, the Nazi, becomes the pervasive character and theme through most of the Indiana Jones movies, and it's really sad. But through the Institute, I was there 11 years. And what happened in those 11 years becomes another whole set of tales, because what was really interesting was that I would go out to a place called the Mayflower Bookshop every Saturday. And every Saturday at lunch, because I was a busy guy, so I'd go out for lunch. And I did that for quite some time until the proprietor, one Bob Thibodeau at that time, Robert Thibodeau now, challenged me. He called me the Anthroposophic Kid, and he challenged me to get the smartest person I know, and he'll get the smartest person he knows, and we're going to get together and we're going to have a debate, because he believed that the theosophical view of Rudolf Steiner taught to him by his teachers was correct, and that I was wrong to tell him what I was telling him about anthroposophy. And so the second time that group met is the first time I actually met John. Even though he worked at the Mayflower and he was there every Saturday for all that time, he was at lunch, and I never got to meet him. But I got to meet Denny Fairchild and Ariel Pommier and all kinds of great psychics and amazing people through the Mayflower. But when I met John, he taught me a little trick, and I no longer had to be just a psychic who didn't use. I would use tarot cards as a buffer. Sometimes I'd look at their palms. Sometimes I, really wasn't looking at anything except the aura. He taught me this little system here. And after that, oh no. Then it really got interesting, because then I could be a reader, and I had a really, really, really good tool where I didn't have to tell anybody I was psychic. I'd say, no, I'm a reader. I'm using this. No. Everything I'm telling you comes from this little card right here. And that became a tool that I never could show when I was a student at the Waldorf Institute or as a teacher at the Detroit Waldorf School that was haunted. But I could use that to get into just about any door that I wanted.
Well, it's important to grasp there's a fundamental concept here, because if you're going to be doing intuitive reading of people, it's good to have something between you and them, because if you're tied into that person too much, that's going to affect the way in which you respond. And in having a device like a astrological chart, or like the device he showed you with playing cards or tarot cards, it enables you to enter into more of an impersonal life that you're focusing on. And because you don't have an agenda that you're serving to try and make something work out a particular way or what have you, it produces a greater clarity. Plus, there is actual objective relationship to the world in which we live that becomes revealed through time as one works with them. But that chart that Douglas just showed you was a chart from Olney Richmond, who founded the Order of Magi in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and then that headquarters were moved to Chicago. And there's been a series of books. One of the authors of one of the principal books was Arnie Lean. He used to come in the bookstore. He'd come to the bookstore with his station wagon, and we buy like boxes of books of what's your card, you know. And so, but then he ended up getting embroiled in lawsuits, so that's out of print. And somebody borrowed my copy, so I don't even have one. But that's okay. You can't do everything all the time. But Douglas came into the Mayflower. Ultimately, when I left, he took over my spot.
Well, only for a year. And then I went on a world tour after that I got stuck in Hawaii for 5 years, but that was pretty cool. But yes, coming to Detroit was the last place of all the beautiful places that I had seen. I can't tell you the sacredness of some of the places I was in. And now I'm in Detroit. Oh man, it was really very, very, very strange. And then a little building, which basically had a few classrooms, and it was the back part of a real estate office, which I think at one point was some kind of fancy building. It's a very beautiful little building, but we only had the back part. And then down the street was the Detroit Waldorf School, and seven houses down was the house I lived in with the doctors McCarthy, and it was a mansion, and the whole third floor was giant. One of the rooms was a ballroom. You could conduct a ball in this room. That's how big it was. And then there were 4 other bedrooms up there. And so I had a little bedroom up there, and I worked for them, but we offered the rooms for any of the anthroposophists who came to teach. And Werner Gloss, the head of the Waldorf Institute, and Hans Gabert, his also co-director, and their wives, Barbara and Rosemary, they when they'd have these guests that he knew because his father was Norbert Gloss, the man who raised him was Norbert Gloss. Both Werner and Hans were Viennese Jews who escaped the onslaught by the hair of their teeth, skin of their teeth, and came to England and then really made their way in Waldorf education and anthroposophy. And Werner was considered probably one of the top scholars in Waldorf education and anthroposophy, certainly who had English mastered. And he is an incredible teacher, wonderful, another one of those people who I can't hardly even describe to you. He was so indescribable.
Yes, Norbert Gloss was Werner's uncle, and but he was a doctor, a medical doctor, and Werner stayed with him along with Rudolf Steiner's brother, who nobody ever mentioned, which is, I'm sure, the way he wanted it. He was a very private person, but Werner Gloss is very significant in the understanding of carrying of Waldorf education and Rudolf Steiner's work to North America. And he was a protege of Walter Johannes Stein, who wrote the 9th century world history in the light of the Holy Grail, and in which has included a great many insights regarding the role of the Order of the Knights Templar and all of these various subjects regarding relics that we've been discussing. And he was part of that small circle of young people that were around Rudolf Steiner that was very interesting, because Walter Stein didn't join the society, and he went to go see Rudolf Steiner talk, and they wouldn't let him in because he didn't have a membership card for a members meeting, a lecture to the members. And Rudolf Steiner walked up and says, well, if he doesn't get in, I don't do my talk. So Walter Stein is just a wonderful soul. Also Jewish, a Viennese Jew who specialized in, he did his doctorate in physics, but he ended up becoming the history teacher for the first Waldorf school in Stuttgart. And so you have that small circle of people. You have Herr Grosse, and you have Ehrenfried Pfeiffer, and just a very small circle of people that were these young people that was Rudolf Steiner was dedicating extra time to. So Vertiglas, Douglas was the protege of Vertiglas, and Vertiglas was the protege of Walter Stein.
Yes, and though I said he was a Viennese Jew, he's a Christian, the most Christian person you'd ever meet. He knew Steiner's Christology backwards and forwards. I think he had memorized the act of consecration of man, which is Steiner's rewriting of the Eucharist. And so Werner was an expert in all things anthroposophy, but because he had connections, he was able to bring the head of the Anthroposophical Society at Dornach is called the Vorstand, and there's a number of members, and there's members of the 11 different sections. He knew them all and brought most of them. He brought the top people in the world to teach there. And here we are in this little place, and these incredible people like Dr. Wolf or Carlo Pietzner or John Davy or Hage Besants or Frederick Hebel or all these people would come and they'd stay at my house, either my house or my dear friend Dr. June Hutchinson's house. She had a monstrous house also with one of these giant ballrooms on the third floor. But anyway, so I'd get to know these people. I'd be giving them the rides where they were going. I'd be basically their host. So I got to know over those years that we were in Indian Village, the top anthroposophist is, I'd pick him up from the airport. I'd take him back to the airport. So I got to have private conversations with all of them. Werner didn't drive, so I drive Werner all around. So I always had his ear. And he fortunately never told anybody I was a Jesuit and never told them that he'd ask me questions. And, because the anthroposophists aren't, supposed to talk to psychics, as it were.
Well, let's clarify. Former Jesuit.
Correct. Absolutely. Wait. At that time, I was still an associate.
Yeah.
I was an associate right up until the time before I quit the Jesuits to become a Waldorf teacher. So I don't remember how many years. I was in the Institute for many years, but I was doing a BA and an MA. And when I was doing my MA, I was a teacher. So I took a class. But before that, I was a kindergarten teacher. And that was my favorite job. And a librarian, and taught recorder, which is a box flute to the children. And my favorite thing was actually being a supervisor on the playground, because that's where you really get to see what's going on with these children. But it was a wonderful, wonderful time, because I basically got to do what I had dreamed of. You see, Hermann Hesse wrote a book called Magister Ludi, where he refers to a place called Castalia. And it's a place where scholarship is the number one thing, but they turn scholarship into a symphonic presentation, which is a synthesis of all science, art, and religion. Basically, what Blavatsky was trying to do, Steiner was trying to do. So I really thought that I'd come to that place, because whatever, I got to learn things I had no idea, even lots of things I existed at all in terms of application with anthroposophy. I'd read all the books. Okay, I'd read all the English books, and some of them I'd read over and over, trying to figure out what he's talking about. But that doesn't help you when it comes down to understanding a synthesis of it, being able to basically be a commentator on anthroposophy itself. It's so hard to do that. It's amazing that then we would have the best people doing this in the world, men and women, eurythmists, the great eurythmists, the great artists, the great teachers, the great philosophers, and people who are very well known in their field. Also, they're anthroposophists. It was incredible. It was truly as though I was got my dream come true, that I went to Castalia.
Well, it's important to keep in mind too that the way Rudolf Steiner approached things was with the eye toward that which was developmental. So, for example, we're talking about Walter Johannes Stein. So what? He goes and he does his doctorate on philosophy. So what does Rudolf Steiner have him teach? He doesn't have him teach philosophy. He has him teach history, because he needs to fill in this other side of his destiny. And so it was always that case. And it's interesting when you get into Rudolf Steiner's comments regarding theater and acting and all of that. And he said it was important that the people that were enacting the mystery dramas that he created had a dedication to spiritual science. And it didn't matter if they were, he didn't need people that, oh, they're a great actor and all this. He didn't care about that at all. What he cared about was the reality of the commitment of the people on stage who were engaging themselves in the mystery drama. And so there's something very real going on here. And a perfect example of it was that for a brief period of time, I ran an office of the Waldorf school in which Douglas was a teacher. It was an inner city Waldorf school. And, you know, at the break time, you'd see there'd be kids like all over the place. And then here comes down the hall Douglas. And he's got his class that they're lined in two lines, walking behind him. And so really proud of themselves that they have it together. And they just come walking through this chaotic throng and looking up at him lovingly, like they recognized that he was giving them something of value. I had never seen anything like that in my life. Seriously, these kids were just, you know, what are they, 3.5 feet tall, maybe? And all walking in two lines behind Dr. Douglas.
That's right. I was the principal of that school and technically the superintendent, but then we were training the teachers, so I had to take a class. So I took a first grade. At first I think I took a class that no one could take. Oh yeah, that class had eaten up 5 teachers. That's right. That was before you came there. That class was so difficult, but they became so beautiful, you know, with love. And that's really all it took. Even though I did have, I was the principal and I had to take the class. And one teacher, most experienced teacher, he had PhD, amazing, amazing person. He came screaming out of the class and yelled, he quit and ran out the door. It was a tough class. And then I took a first grade, and that was beautiful because then I could show the other teachers what I was talking about because I was doing teacher training there too. And that school, Oasis Academy, became the #1 school in Michigan, both in scores on tests that we didn't take tests. But when we took the tests, we scored higher than everybody else, and no one could understand that because we used a type of education, Waldorf education, that brought learning up through the will into feeling and then into thinking. And if you build good habits with the child because you expect good habits, because it's rhythmically what you do, it's ritualistically what you do, of course, then these children excel like crazy. You can't stop them from excelling. Matter of fact, all the children that came into, well, I'd have to say, without bragging, but my class and other good teachers' classes, even though they were classified as, you know, psychological disorders, special education, this and that, no, if they stayed for, you know, 5 or more years, they became normal as everyone. Everyone was being taught a healing education. And so I studied that for all those years. And to me, that was like just the greatest thing that I could do. I finally figured out my true vocation.
Well, there's another aspect to it that's been noticed in the Detroit area, the impact of Waldorf education is that these symphonies of the Waldorf school would seem to always win, you know, that they just really, really had it together. And it's understanding the emphasis that Rudolf Steiner put on the art of education, and that it's through the arts that we can give the opportunity for an individual to find aspects of themselves that they might not have been able to unfold in another circumstance. And it's important to understand it isn't about indoctrinating children into something. It has to do with showing them an appreciation for world culture and learning myths and legends from all different lands, and that people would be free to gravitate one way or the other and unfolding themselves and having a system of education that was resonant with the developmental cycles of the child in reference to the developmental cycles of history. And so it's just an absolutely majestic way of approaching the world.
That's right. And that's why I wrote the book, The Spirit of Childhood, which is kind of hard to get these days. But then another book that we are doing, which you can get a free PDF of, is The Eternal Curriculum, which teaches parents, teachers how to teach themselves to teach the children, as well as what to teach the children. And if you're going to teach the children from first through eighth grade, then you're teaching their etheric body. So you need to know what the etheric body is. So I recommend another book we produced for teachers called, what's it called? The Eternal Ethers, A Theory of Everything. Because then you understand what it is that you're doing in these periods that John just talked about. And then it becomes, Rudolf Steiner said, and of course, this is what I was always looking for, but hadn't quite put into words. It becomes one of the paths of initiation that you can take in the modern world, training students first through eighth grade. So you stay with the same children first through eighth grade, and you get them through, their difficult years because you're a force of love. You become a member of the family, as it were. And in matter of fact, you spend more time with the children than their parents spend with them. And, as John said, these children have tremendous capacities. For instance, when I took a class, I tried to do everything Steiner said. I was very obsessive. And that means that he said the best thing that could happen is if the teacher and the students all learn violin together. So I had to learn violin, of course, and I had to learn right along with them, because it's what the teacher shows them as the way the teacher learns. That's the example. That's the model they're following. So whatever the teacher can do, the students can do. And if the teachers can't do it, so you really have to sharpen yourself every year, teaching a new curriculum. It's the most difficult job you can possibly ever have. You never feel as if you're complete, and you have to dedicate your whole life, and you get paid little money. So yes, I highly recommend being a Waldorf teacher. No, only if you really want to study Rudolf Steiner, because he is showing you exactly what he's talking about when he uses the curriculum to help build up the etheric body of the child. Another example, then the music teacher comes into my class, and my children all went far beyond me on violin. I couldn't keep up. They were unlimited, because then when the real violin teacher comes in, they can do whatever that teacher can do, right? So I had a very good memory in those days, and I memorized everything, and the children memorized all of that, and they would tax out their teachers. Their poor language teachers would come in the first year and said, I've already reached the end of my limit of second grade with them, and they've memorized everything. Could you slow down a little bit? I'm like, no, what do you mean slow down? I'm not even in there with you. Well, that's not true. I was sitting in the back, but still I couldn't keep up. So whatever my greatest capacity was theirs. So when we got to Shakespeare, myself and the prompter and half the children memorized the whole play, uncut, unedited. It was nothing to them. Their memories were beyond anything you can imagine. And you're going, wait a second. This child here was sent to you as the worst special ed child, psychological disorder that you can get. She was the most disruptive student that you could possibly imagine. And she became perfect. Virtuoso violinist, a virtuoso on another instrument. These children would win art awards. They'd win poetry awards, anything they entered. So one girl, I won't say her name, even though she's now a famous photographer for National Geographic and other things, she said, do you know, she came one day and said, it says if I draw this picture, they're going to give me a bike. And I'm going, well, let's do it. So she draws the picture, she wins the bike, and then she decided to win every contest there was like that. And she did, and she became literally a world-renowned photographer. Because why? She decided that was one of her things. She also, also a virtuoso violinist, a virtuoso clarinetist or whatever, and blah, 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 blah. Performed Shakespeare, we wrote our own plays. In those cases, in the younger grades, we wrote our own plays. I wrote the songs for them. They learned everything that I could possibly do with them as long as I did it. And so we did 45 minutes of dance in the morning, because that's the way you're supposed to start the day, dancing and singing. So that's what we did. Why? I was a Sufi dance leader. I could do circle dances all day long, right? And so then they'd wear out their eurythmy teacher, the one who teaches this special form of movement, wear them out. They didn't have enough materials for these children to learn, right? And what was it? It was, I think, because I love them. I think that's really it, because I loved them enough to do the work, and then they saw that, and then they replicated it, modeled it, and went beyond me.
Yeah, the rising tide lifts all boats, right? Like JFK said. And so you have this idea of learning by example. And if a teacher can actually become the embodiment of moral imagination, moral inspiration, and moral intuition for the child, it gives them a pathway to where they can find it within their own nature, without having to have it something that's forced upon them. But it's like watering a flower; it grows, and so that it's wonderful. These stories are so great. The time is flying so fast, but we've just blasted through a few thousand years in this episode here, in the blink of an eye. And so I really want to thank everybody for tuning in, and I want to thank Tyler for dreaming this up, and I want to thank Douglas for sharing from his heart. My name is John Bardwell, and I'm here happy to help tell the story of Dr. Douglas Gabriel.